Welcome to Brookline Hub in Depth. I'm your host, Harvey Bravman. I'm the founder and publisher of BrooklineHub.com and the Brookline Youth Awards. Hope you all join us for our 11th Brookline Youth Awards that will be on April 29th. I am here with Raul Fernandez, Brookline Hub in Depth. We hope to bring you impactful interviews with the important people, organizations, and subject matters that affect the Brookline community. Today, we'll be talking with one of the important people and talking about one of the important subject matters. I want to thank you, Raul, for your service. This is Raul Fernandez, Select Board Member of Brookline. I want to thank you for your service to the community, especially since the onset of the pandemic. And also thank the volunteers for both the Reform Police Task Force and your task force, the Reimagining Task Force. Both task forces it was obvious that a lot of effort went into this, and not only effort, but effort from very skilled people went into putting this together. First off, Raul, tell me a little about the last year from the perspective of being a Brookline Select Board member and also being a human being trying to navigate the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, first off, Harvey, thanks for having me here and for doing this series, but all you do for Brookline, it's so important. This last year, like a lot of folks, it's been a difficult year. With its sort of bright moments here and there, and sort of family and has been really good. Fortunately, my family has been well, and that's been great. But of course, it's been tough. It's been tough trying to figure out how to reorient ourselves to work, to each other, to community engagement and what that looks like, to this work on the select board. I think as a community, we've done a fairly good job keeping cases low, a fairly good job finding ways to continue the important work that needs to happen, even despite this pandemic that's going on, and finding ways to support each other, to try to support our small businesses where we can, to do the things that we know we need to do to make sure that we've got a strong community on the other side of this. So it's been a bit of a tough year, but I think I'm proud of sort of how we collectively have gotten through it, and fortunately I'm feeling pretty good myself about where things are looking right now.
Great. One of the things that the pandemic brought us is maybe one of the only positive things. After the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers, the Black Lives Matter movement took to the streets, and millions of people that were previously not Black Lives Matter supporters, or maybe not publicly Black Lives Matter supporters in our neighborhood. We certainly see a lot more Black Lives Matter signs and posters, and people wanting publicly say that they support the movement. I'm assuming that the Reimagining Brookline Police Task Force and the Reform Brookline Task Force stemmed from this. Is that true?
Yeah, I think it was these groups are a direct result of the sort of this righteous uprising and awakening, this multicultural, multi-generational awakening around the need to meaningfully address issues around racial equity, including those that pose an existential threat to communities of color, and particularly Black people, and namely police. And that a recognition that that despite countless past efforts at reform, policing has not necessarily become safer for communities of color, and not just safer, but more accountable, more transparent, more dignified. It, there have been modest improvements, but not of the kind that all those people you talk about went out into the streets to demand. And so the creation of certainly the task force to reimagine policing in Brookline was a result of that. I think the reform committee was a necessary creation. I don't know that it addresses, frankly, the issues that people have been in the streets, trying to get communities to not just make policing safer, but the call really was um, to reinvest the funds that we're currently putting into policing to actually addressing the issues that 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 police are maybe trying at their best to address the symptoms of, and that's the call, and that's why I'm proud of the work of the task force in particular, because we've heeded that call.
How was it decided that there be two task forces? How did that come to?
Yeah. Well, during the first week of June, I proposed the creation of a task force to reimagine policing in Brookline. I did that through a Medium piece that I then shared broadly, including with the board itself. Um, Around that time, we also were heading into town meeting, and there were a couple of warrant articles related to the budget amendments, essentially, that would actually take money from policing and effectively put it in social services. Uh, and and so it was decided that we were going to see what happens at town meeting first, and then take up this proposal that I brought forward. There was some small shift in funding. I think it's 166,000 from the overtime budget of the police that shifted into some social services. But that was it. The other budget amendments failed at town meeting, and a lot of town meeting members said, at least what I heard, was um, we want to see what happens with this task force first. We don't want to just take funds from the police and put it somewhere else. We want there to be some kind of plan or idea about what that might look like. Okay. And then for the next, town meeting ends sort of toward the end of June. And for the next month, we had debates about this proposal that I'd put forward. And ultimately, I think it was maybe July 23rd, that night, we had a very long debate about it. And along the way, there were folks who didn't necessarily support the idea of reimagining police. We hear a lot, and we still hear we have a very good police department, but it's not perfect. But we're not Minneapolis, we're not Louisville, we're not all these other places. Uh, and so there was some resistance just to the idea that we even needed to do this work, frankly. That all that we needed were these sort of modest reforms. Um, but also, questions about like who should be on the task force, and all the things that delay the creation of something like this, and try to undermine the work of it, frankly, I think. And then finally, the a majority of the board voted to create a body that I didn't support. And by the way, neither did Bernard Green, the chair of the select board, and the person that now chairs the reform committee. He and I both voted against it. And at that point, I said, I'm out. I said, this is the folks, the people that have brought us to this point are asking for something very different than this board wants to deliver. I'm not going to spend the next 6 months of my life spinning my wheels working on something I don't believe in. And so we were kind of at an impasse. And then later on that night, we ended up actually voting again, and a unanimous select board supported creating one reform committee that Bernard chairs, and the other reimagining task force that I chair. And that sort of set us on our work, and we finally were able to convene in August and have been meeting ever since.
The one of the I remember last summer just being incensed that someone came up with the term defund police. I felt that as a person who would love to see a police forces all over reimagined, the idea of the funding then led to this, I would say the other side, the people who are right leaning, um, politically, to say that what was being said was that the police forces should be eliminated, and really the funding really should have been reimagined, right?
Well, I mean, it's not, defunding is not something I ever talk about. My strategy is let's figure out what the best model is for our community and then shift resources to support that model. Period. Uh, the um, the idea around reimagining is not starting with the presumption. Reform starts with the presumption that policing is the right strategy to solving our
Right.
problems. Reimagining eliminates that presumption and says, what are our problems? Now, what's the right strategy to solve them? And what role do police, particularly armed police officers, have, if any, in addressing those issues? Now, there's no question that in my mind anyway, that currently today, there is a role for armed police officers in our community. For instance, I've said before, if there were to be forbid some kind of shooting at one of our houses of worship, I don't think we're going to send in social workers to stop that threat, right? In a country where there are more guns than humans, I think it makes sense to have some kind of armed personnel to protect our community. With that said, the creep of policing into the social service world, the creep of policing into schools, the creep of policing into public housing, and into these other spaces that aren't about really directly about public safety, but are about something altogether different. Um, that's one area where it makes sense to be able to step back and say, if I had, I don't know, 7 positions, and someone said, I've got 7 positions for you in Brookline town government, and the role of those positions is to address social service needs, where do you want them? Frankly, the last place I would say I need them is in the police department. But we do have those positions in social service work in the department, and we have them through the Walk and Talk program, which is a program that since the 90s has been in public housing, which without a signed agreement. So there's never been an MOU between the Brookline Housing Authority and the town of Brookline about exactly what those officers are expected to be doing, and no measurable outcomes for those officers either. So there's no way to measure the success of that particular unit, which is problematic in and of itself. Similarly, with the school resource officer role, those positions are funded by the police department. But if you ask folks in school leadership, would they rather have that funding and have social workers in the department rather than an officer masquerading as a social worker? They'll tell you themselves they'd rather actually have the funding and have a social worker there, to work with youth that might be, in trouble or in need of sort of diversionary, support or whatever it is. So it really is for me a matter of just stepping back and saying, let's focus on the issues that we have and how we can best address those issues. It isn't about good or bad police officers. I don't think that one needs to conclude. It's not necessary to conclude that we have a good or bad department to determine that we should be investing resources differently than we currently are. And so that's been the approach of our work. It hasn't been let's defund and then figure out what to do with the funds when we get them. It's this model we know is not working for many people. That's the other piece that I think is really important to understand, is that yes, there were folks marching in Brookline in support of fighting for justice for George Floyd and so many others. But if you were at those events and you went to the portions of those marches where people were speaking, what you noticed is that they were speaking about Brookline. They were speaking about policing in Brookline. And there were numerous events. It was that really large march, of course, that went to Amory Park, and there were speeches there and then ended up at the police department, and people were speaking there too. And I heard those voices. There was the Humanize Black Voices event that was over on Cypress Field, and I heard those voices. And there were the numerous protests led by the Aniosa family along Route 9, and then later on in front of the library and the police department. And I heard those voices of people in Brookline who had issues with policing here. So, this narrative that the Brookline Police Department is being held accountable for things that are happening thousands of miles away is it's a false narrative. There are issues here. That said, we think that that there is a way to sort of really think through how we solve problems in our community, and that there's just a better way than putting armed police to solve those problems. And frankly, they haven't solved those problems. There's no question, by the way, Harvey, if if someone's driving through Brookline, they'd rather be you than me.
Right.
There's no question about it when you look at the data. With stops, but then also when you're stopped, how you're treated, whether or not you get a warning or a ticket, you're much more likely to get off with a warning if you're white in Brookline than if you're not. When we look at 2,000 speeding stops,
Right.
that was clear as day. So I think what we see is all these different bits of information that are aligning with one another, and so any one bit you can say, well, maybe there's some, I don't know, maybe there's some other explanation for that. But when you line them all up and you say, we've looked at data in all these different ways and collected data in all these different ways, and they're aligning with one another, that gives you some pretty good confidence that that the direction in which they're pointing is toward the truth.
Right.
And so, yeah.
And when I was listening to or watching both presentations, talk about the traffic data, what you just mentioned, what the interaction was like with the officer, the you or I, and if the officer has a smile on his face when he comes to the car, the discussion, or whether it's right away a confrontational situation that could lead to a ticket because of hostilities that brew between the two people that make the driver feel either threatened or intimidated or angry or anxious. And so I'm assuming that motorists that feel that way are most likely to have interactions with police that are not healthy, when they're not approached in a healthy way by the officer. And unless we're just analyzing body cam, videos, you're not seeing all of that, and not seeing that this or the instances where an American is pulled over, and the reason that they don't get the ticket is because they are so subservient, because they've been trained by their parents that the police are dangerous, that the view of the police officer as a man with a gun, not that just came to your car, not as someone that is on your side.
And it's not from nowhere, right? I mean, that's,
Right.
If you think about, for instance, somebody like Sandra Bland, who ended up dying in police custody, she got pulled over for failure to signal. And because the officer there did not think she was being deferential enough to him, because she in this moment decided while she was waiting to get her ticket, to smoke a cigarette, and he wanted her to put it out, and she said, why should I put it out? Like, I'm in my car, it's my property, I'm able to do this. Like, I'd just like my ticket and be able to go on the way. He ended up literally dragging her out of the car. Remember, at that point, she had committed no crime. Failure to signal was the only infraction she had committed. And because she wasn't deferential enough, she was literally dragged out of her car by this man. And I'm not even sure what resisting arrest, but for what? She had done nothing to be arrested for, right? That's one instance. The instance with Fernando Castile being another one, where he was someone who lived in a state where you could carry a gun with a license, and did exactly what you want somebody to do, which is say, "Officer, I have a gun. I also have a license for that gun," and then was shot and killed, having not reached for the done anything, just literally was just shot. These are the things that people. It's not just fairy tales. These things have happened, and folks are right. And there's the list can go on and on and on and on and on, of course. And that these are concerns that people have. We've got to again step back and think. Ask ourselves, why are we having armed officers give traffic tickets? The thing we want people to do is to drive more safely, right? Is to maybe not go so fast, is to maybe have stopped a little bit longer at that stop sign or whatever it is, right? Why is it necessary that officers be the one to to do this work? We're not so sure that it is, frankly. Now,
Do you think that if it was non-officers, that motorists would be more likely to ignore them and keep driving, or?
I think not, honestly. I mean, that's kind of like I think not. It's not that people aren't disrespectful, for instance, to traffic enforcement officers that give parking tickets. Sometimes they are, right? People can just be mean. But the ticket is written and the infraction is cited, and there you go. I mean, it is what it is. Now are you asking if a car came up behind you and you knew Brookline didn't have officers do traffic enforcement,
Right,
if somebody would just ignore it? I suppose they could, but then there's a recourse, right?
right,
Then there's failure to stop for a traffic enforcement officer, and you can actually have some kind of fine associated with that. And all you have to do is actually be able to capture their license plate,
right.
and make a report and be able to do that. So I think there's ways to deal with that. I think what happens here though is what you end up doing is decreasing the stress level, because people say, well, traffic stops are dangerous. And I
Mhm.
say, well, they're dangerous because cops conduct them, right? If you know that you're getting pulled over and it's not by an officer, and the only possible reason you're getting pulled over is because you committed a traffic infraction, and the only thing that's going to happen in that encounter is you get a ticket. No one's looking up to see if you have warrants. Nobody's going to ask you to get out of your car. No one's going to search your vehicle or anything like that. All they're going to do is give you a ticket. You pull over, you get the ticket. Maybe you try to talk yourself out of it, but
Right.
you get the ticket and you go on your way. And that's it. There is no reason why that ends up being a violent encounter, right? No reason whatsoever. But we have to sort of change our orientation to what a traffic stop is. There are also all kinds of issues around bias just with traffic stops, right? So select board member Hamilton asked, like, well, if you have non-police doing traffic stops, don't you still end up with bias? And the answer is potentially. You don't end up with the kind of bias that leads to
Sure.
someone being handcuffed unnecessarily, or a violent encounter, or those kinds of things. Um, let me by the way say one other thing that I think is really important. Uh, there is a narrative that I think some people hold in their minds, that police conduct traffic stops, and in those traffic stops they get violent or dangerous people off the streets and weapons and things like that. One of the things that we saw clearly in the data provided by the police department is that almost no traffic stops, just traffic stops alone, lead to any dangerous person or thing getting off the streets. It just doesn't happen in Brookline. What When you do see arrests connected with a traffic stop, it's because somebody was driving recklessly and speeding and was under the influence of alcohol. Then you see an arrest with that traffic stop. But the idea that there are simple traffic stops for a broken tail light or failure to signal, or even speeding, that somehow lead to getting dangerous people off the streets, it is a fantasy. It simply doesn't happen. And so I think we need to take that and remove that from the equation, because when we look at the data, it just doesn't happen. We're just talking about who should be giving tickets to people when they go too fast. That's all we're talking about right now. And again, I don't think that having police do it meets the necessary standard, that it's necessary that police do it, then we have to hit all of our other points. Is it better that we do, is the better to do it than not do it, and all those other things? And I think some of those questions are debatable.
We're going to take a quick break for some information on our nonprofit brooklinehub.com, and then catch you all on the other side.
Hi, my name is Danielle Myers of ADW Video Productions and BrooklineHub.com. BrooklineHub.com is a 501c3 nonprofit online publication dedicated to community building through local reporting and events. Brookline Facing Civil Rights was produced by our founder, Harvey Bravman. The film is about the experiences of African Americans who helped break the wall of segregation that existed in Brookline before the civil rights laws were passed in the 1960s. Last year, the film sold out the Coolidge Corner Theater and included a panel discussion on inclusivity. You can stream the film and the discussion on BrooklineHub.com in exchange for a donation to the Brookline Community Foundation's Safety Net Fund. You can also stream Soul Witness, a film that features interviews with Brookline Holocaust survivors conducted 30 years ago, on soulwitness.org.
We're back with Raul Fernandez, Select Board member for Brookline. In this conversation, I think of a book that I read by Tanisi Coates, I think it was called Between the World and I, and he talked about what he called for those who perceive themselves to be white, and he talks about the communities where that are where the population of those that perceive themselves to be white, in other words, high income, and that in those communities, people look to the police department to keep them safe and to protect their property, and less important to them is justice. And they'll often say the police keep us safe, and Brookline is sort of the tale of two communities, isn't it? You have a very high income population whose interaction with police is in their, high-end automobiles is one thing. And then you have lower income, more diverse population who has a completely different interaction with police department, both in their own personal history and then, them being the same race or ethnicity as others who have been persecuted. And then we're trying to create a department that's these two different worlds, aren't we?
Yeah, I suppose so. What I'll say is that that there's not any daylight between folks, and this one point between folks who want to reimagine public safety in Brookline and those who think who like the current model. The thing that they both want is to be safe, right, and to have safe, thriving communities, right? But the key distinction here is that that one group either believes that everyone is safe, or is not concerned that others might be unsafe because they are. And there is a certain human tendency, by the way, to believe that something isn't a problem for anyone else because it isn't a problem for you or anyone you know. And so it may be that some of those folks are just simply blinded. They just aren't aware that other people are having dramatically different experiences with the same department that they're having phenomenal experiences with, right? And that's sort of always been my position here is they just don't know, right? And so the more that we can do to make people aware that that while this is working for you, it's not working for everyone, and therefore we all collectively need to find a better way forward. But the other piece is that no one who's been working on this reimagining work wants Brookline to be a less safe community. We're all residents. We all live here. We all want this to be a safe community. So, the idea that we would sacrifice our own safety, and more to the point, the safety of our families, uh, you know, for, you know, in order to stick it to the police department or whatever people think, is it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't follow, because we all live here and we all want this to be a safe community. So I think you're right that people are having dramatically different experiences, and the experience that they're having in the community um, orients them differently to the same department. And by the way, people are policed different. We know that. So we were talking about traffic stop data before. One of the big sort of disconnects that we see, and encourage you to check it out. The police department just put out their newest annual report for 2020. And one of the things that we see in there is a police department that says, we continue to provide services without any gender, I think they mentioned, but also racial bias. And what it misses is that there are disparities, and the disparities are evident in the own report, in their very same report, where they sort of lead in to say, yeah, we're providing services without bias. And there is bias in every field. We know that there's bias in the filmmaking world, there's bias in the academic world, there's bias in the fashion world, there's bias in every field out there. So to think that it doesn't exist in policing, I think is putting your head in the sand. What we see with those traffic stops, for instance, is that 18.26% of those stopped in Brookline, that's nearly 1 in 5 people stopped in Brookline, are Black. Now, either you've got to believe one of two things. Either you got to believe that 1 in 5 drivers in Brookline are Black, right? Which the data shows that's not the case, and also your own eyes tell you that's not the case, right? Or you've got to believe something else, which is that Black drivers are that much worse, that's significantly worse, that they're getting stopped at much higher rates than anybody else in Brookline. Or you see that there's some racial disparity in the data, and it's either implicit bias or some measure of direct bias or whatever it is, but there's a disparity here that can't be explained in any other way than race. And that's where we are with those data. And so this is, when we talk about, I think this is difficult for people to understand, so I just want to put a fine point on it, is we talk about things like disparate impact. And what we see is, when you cannot trace any one stop, right? You may be able to, but it's difficult to trace any one stop to either direct bias or implicit bias. We just never know enough of what's happening in someone's head to know whether or not that particular stop was related to some form of bias. We just can't know, right? But when we look at the big data, when we look at the numbers and we see the differential, that's how we know the bias is there. It may not be racism with a capital R, but we do know we have a racist system in which, again, if you rather be Harvey than Raul driving around the streets of Brookline, there's no question about it, because we also see those data with Latinx drivers, and by the way, Asian drivers too in Brookline, right? The other thing that's important to recognize is that the vast majority of people stopped driving in Brookline don't live in Brookline. It's actually, I think Brookline residents account for only 14% of stops in Brookline. The 86% of stops are people who do not live in Brookline, right? In any case, I think that's one of those, we've got to look at a disparate impact, and we've got to be willing to say there's a problem if we're going to do anything if we have any hope of fixing that problem. And what I've been trying to do, and I think our task force is trying to do, is, even as we think that much of what we should be doing going forward is reinvesting resources rather than spending money to solve the symptoms of issues, investing money to solve the problems themselves. We think that, but we know there's still going to be a police department at the end of this process. And our position, I think, has been, they've got to come to the table and be willing to admit that it's not all roses, that there are real issues that need to be addressed. And until, the department, you mentioned Prentice Pilot before, and Zaraimus Gun, another officer, both who blew the whistle on racism within the department. I mean, this is, it's this idea that, those folks, they just don't know us well enough. And here are two officers in the department, and this isn't that long ago, who tell you there are issues with this department. But it seems like everyone that raises their hand and says, I have an issue, there's some way to excuse or dismiss those people. And that's young people, that's families in Brookline Housing Authority properties, and that's these two officers themselves who said there are issues. But we just continue to see this, and I from the very beginning, Harvey, like before I was even elected to being a select board member, I reached out to and met with Chief O'Leary to say, like, hey, I think policing is a real important issue. I'd love to like know more about it in Brookline and work with them on these issues. When Andy Lipson became chief, I did the exact same thing, and I met with him a number of times to meet with him and talk about these issues. And it's unfortunately, what we haven't seen enough of is the department, expressing an openness to address, some of the tougher issues that are going on right now. And I'm sad to say, I don't think that the reform efforts that have been ongoing this year have dug deep enough to really address those issues.
When you mentioned rather be me than you, I just wanted to bring up the as a Jewish person, it's always difficult because we originally derived from the Middle East, so more like Iraq, Iran, that Egypt, that kind of area, Israel, obviously. But a lot of us are born this generation into relative privilege. I was pretty poor when I grew up, but I'm dirt poor actually. But it's always interesting because like we're considered white except by white supremacists.
Right. Right. They've got enough hate to go around. Right. It seems. Yeah.
So I just lost sight of my question there for a second, but regained it quickly. The positive side to your one of the positives to your recommendations, the reimagining task force recommendations, is those people who think that Brookline Police is doing a great job, that have had no negative interactions with Brookline Police, that think that Brookline Police is totally unbiased, and across the board they have just a favorable opinion. None of these proposals that your task force is making will have a negative effect on those people, right? I mean, there's no downside for that.
Right, that's exactly right. I mean, we look at the totality of recommendations, and everywhere we look, we don't see anything that's going to make our own families less safe. And by that, we also say other people's families less safe. It's just a critical piece there. And I think we probably need to talk more about that, because I understand that that's a driver for people, that they and I think also, this task force has suffered from what a lot of groups do, which is people believing that the task force is doing something that it's simply not doing, right? Which is trying to disband the police, or trying to defund the police, or trying to abolish or eliminate policing. That's not been one conversation during one meeting over the last 6 months. It's not what we're talking about at all.
Let me ask you this. I think this will help with your 2 years from today. Mm-hmm. Or 3, however long it will take to implement everything. Give us a vision of what Brookline will look like, what the police force will look like, but also what the Brookline Forward or whatever it ends up being called looks like. How does it all look?
Right. So our vision is to create a new agency in the town of Brookline. Our code name is Brookline Forward. It might be called something else. But the idea here is to take existing services. I mean, we have the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, the Council on Aging, Veteran Services, these types of social services that we have, as well as the sort of health and human services what most people know as the health department, and really start to bring some of those services together in a way in which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And get more coordination going on, and enhancing those services with an Office of Youth and Family Services, an Office of Immigrant and Refugee Services, an office around economic equity. And what we're talking about here specifically is really starting to better understand the root causes of inequity in Brookline, right? So we're talking about people not just who are able to provide direct social services, i.e. social workers, but people with the ability to analyze data, to conduct assessments in our community, to really get at the heart of where the pain points are for the people in our community who need it most. And those are vulnerable populations, like some that I mentioned, like the elderly population in Brookline, folks who live in public housing and subsidized housing, communities of color, young people, like, those populations in Brookline. What are the pain points, and how do we actually work to address these longstanding issues with meaningful, durable solutions that are actually going to work over time, not just sort of like address the symptoms when they flare up. So that's a big piece of it. Another piece of it is, and this came through the work of our subcommittee on vulnerable people and people in crisis. And this is building out a team, much like folks have heard of maybe the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon. In Denver, there's also the STAR program. And what they do is they actually send out a different team that are not police on calls that are not dangerous calls, right? And there's a very strict protocol. If there's a chance that this might be a dangerous call, police take the lead. If there's no chance that police that there would be a dangerous that this will be a dangerous call, they don't. And what we saw, for instance, in Denver, they've been operating for 6 months, and I think it was 748 calls that they've addressed. And that group, which is usually someone with a social work background and somebody with a medical background, they've responded to that number of incidents, and no one has been arrested. There's been no need to bring in the courts. All the costs, by the way, associated with that too. There are costs to counties, municipalities to do those kinds of things. That's not been needed over 6 months. And by the way, that program in Denver is actually supported by the police chief, is fully on board with that program. And so we think that there are ways that programs like those, and a police department that's squarely focused on fighting crime and investigating crime, those kinds of things, can operate in harmony in the same place. It's just all about who's taking the lead, because the police department doesn't go away. So if there's a need to sort of bring in the department for support, then that exists. They're right there, and that's not a problem. But the coordination that an agency like this can do, for instance, to work with the fire department and the housing department to make sure that people are living in safe housing within Brookline, and to address issues related to safe housing in Brookline, like that's where this agency can really shine. That sort of working with the health department and outside agencies on this Cahoots-like model to address issues related to mental health issues and other issues, nonviolent issues. And yes, working with the police as necessary on diversionary programming to make sure that youth don't end up in the sort of criminal justice system. But having this group take the lead on that. And right now, you hear this around the country, and even in Brookline, we've heard it too, is the police have stepped in because the other resources weren't there. What we're saying is, okay, let's provide the resources so they don't have to step in those ways, and let's have them focus on their core mission. Reimagining in and of itself is not going to make the policing any safer, more transparent, more accountable, and oversight needs to do that, right? And so, to the extent that there are less police civilian encounters, then inherently policing becomes more safe. However, we've got to figure out, there are things, for instance, like, and this is an area where maybe Brookline's done better than some of our peer communities, but in with respect to de-escalation training, bias training and things like that. But with that said, I think there's a way that oversight can actually help if the police department doesn't think of it as a negative and doesn't approach it as a negative, but rather approaches it from a simple place, which is a community gets to decide how it's policed, not the other way around. And this is something that Brookline residents, I think, really need to take to heart, that we don't have to be policed in this way just because Boston is, or Newton is, or Minneapolis is, or some other place. We get to decide. This is our Brookline police force. We get to decide how we're policed, right? And there's some limitations at the state level and elsewhere, but for the most part, we get to decide this approach. We also get to decide, how we hold officers accountable for doing things that we as a community have decided are not within the scope of their duties. And that it includes use of force, but also if you look into the data from that survey that we talked about before, there were the opportunities to write free form responses, and certainly the opportunity, say, if you've had good experiences, tell us about those, and people did. But the opportunity to say, if you've had bad experiences, tell us about those, and people did. The number one thing we saw in there was rudeness, disrespect, surliness on behalf of police officers in Brookline. And that's one area where there needs to be a lot more oversight and engagement to get involved in training that out, because you've already got all the power. You've got the gun, you've got the badge, you've got the authority. You literally have the authority to put your hands on someone, to put someone in cuffs, to detain them, to do all these things. You don't need to be rude to them. You don't need to be mean to them along the way. You just simply don't. And we see that happening. I mean, you just look down the list and it comes up over and over and over again. And these letters only went out to Brookline residents to have them do this. So we don't even know the stories, Harvey, of the people who passed through Brookline and dealt with those kinds of things. Right. We only know the stories of Brookline residents, and there are many. So that's, we do think that there needs to be some significant oversight there, and that frankly there should be. I mean, this shouldn't be unfamiliar if you think about the sort of the military, that there's civilian oversight of the military. I mean, this is not unheard of. Now, what some people think is that the select board is the one that's supposed to provide that oversight, and they're not wrong about that. The issue is the select board doesn't have the ability to provide what's really needed is frankly almost week to week oversight of this department. And the select boards, oversees all these different departments, and there are lots of things going on at any given time. And the select board members are all virtually unpaid part-time people. What we need is a different body that's going to have eyes on a regular basis, that it's going to be in consistent communication with the chief and the higher ups, as well as talking to rank and file officers and doing the sort of week to week work of making policing better in Brookline.
And the police department has such a tough task. Aside from the actual work of policing, it's basically set up, if you look at the police department, that building, it's set up like a company. And so any of us who have ever worked in the company, you're loyal, you get in trenches with your fellow employees, and in their case, they're in the trenches with fellow employees that are trying to fight crime. And the tendency is to protect each other and to be loyal to each other. And so it's a difficult task for the upper management of this police department, that to really enforce, or to the messaging with the police officers, that their loyalty is to justice and to the community, and not to each other. And that's not very intuitive. So I believe it has to be trained, doesn't it? I mean,
I think so. I think, yeah, training and then accountability is key. So one of the provisions of this new state law is around the responsibility for officers to step up when they see something that's out of line. And that wasn't required before. remarkably, right? But will they is a big question. Will they actually do that, right? So some of it's training, some of it's accountability, and some of it is hiring the right people in the first place, who are there for the right reasons. As you mentioned, there is this culture though, and we have these pseudo sort of military organization structures, right, where there are sergeants and lieutenants and those kinds of things, and then it sort of switches to superintendents and a chief and everything. But this sort of these ranks and everything. Someone's brought up, why do they have to have any of those ranks anyway? Why can't there be some different non-military sort of structure or ranking to it? And again, just sort of rethinking what their approach is. I'll say one other key issue, and this needs to get addressed. This is something that we've seen as board members for a couple of years now that I've been on, and I know before that, is we think about oversight within the department, right? That there's an office, there's an internal affairs, right? IA, when you watch the shows, IA, right? And that there are all these departments, there are all these precincts, and then there's like IA, which is somewhere downtown always, right? You get brought downtown, and this office down there, and those are the people that actually investigate officers when, potential misconduct, those kinds of things.
Sure.
What we have in Brookline is one precinct. There's no other precinct. There's just the one. And everybody's in the same building, and it's a relatively small precinct. It's pretty, there's a lot of folks that work there, but it's relatively small. And we have this Office of Professional Responsibility. I don't know how. I mean, frankly, if I was charged with holding other faculty members accountable for misconduct, right? You can imagine me having a relationship with those officers, could lead to some form of bias, or at least the perception by others that there might be bias in my decisions about how to treat this case versus that case. We want to remove that completely. We just don't think there's a need for an Office of Professional Responsibility that is at least not one that's adjudicating complaints within the police department. That could live in this civilian oversight body, that could live in the human resource department somewhere, but it doesn't need to live in this small police department with a lot of people who know each other really well, including folks who know each other from like grade school and high school in Brookline. It's just too close to home. It's too incestuous, and it doesn't give people in our community the faith that the investigations that occur there are faithful investigations, that they're reaching conclusions without any bias or prejudice whatsoever. And frankly, as someone who's seen enough reports coming out of there, one of the things that I often, whenever there's a disagreement between parties, I always think, it's usually like an 80-20 disagreement. Like someone's right, but they also probably could have done something better, right? That is leading the other person to be upset about this circumstance. I've yet to see an 80-20 police report related to police misconduct. What I see are ones that say the police got it absolutely right, and this other person is just loony bins.
Right.
And I've seen it over and over and over again. And it doesn't give me the faith that when I get an appeal that comes my way as a select board member, and as they say, police commissioner, when an appeal comes our way, I don't know whether to rely on this report or not. And that should never happen. I should be able to say, look, a faithful investigation was conducted with no bias, no prejudice whatsoever. And here were the findings. Now let me build on that and try to understand more of the situation. But I certainly, as a board member, don't have any faith in those reports right now.
And they're conducted by people who are in that building, and they risk every other member of that building coming down on them.
I wouldn't want to be in that position, Harvey. I really wouldn't. And maybe, the folks that are doing that work would say, well, Raul, you just don't know that you're questioning our integrity. It's not about that at all, folks. Like it is, this is the thing about bias, and particularly implicit bias. If you are a police officer, then you're probably more inclined to see the perspective of the person who is a police officer. if you know the folks you're investigating, you're probably more inclined to understand their perspective than the folks who you've never met before. It is just, it isn't about integrity at all, or questioning anybody's integrity. I always say, you can take, if you take good people and you put them in a bad system, you get bad outcomes. It doesn't matter how good that person is. And this is a bad system. It's not about good or bad people. It's a bad system, and it leads to bad outcomes. That's what we need to get rid of.
Are there any questions that I didn't ask you that I should have?
Man, we covered so much right now.
Right.
I think what happens going forward, one of the things I'll say is that that the select board certainly has some decisions to make, but the select board's not the only body here. The Brookline Housing Authority has a board of commissioners, and they've got some decisions to make relative to this walk and talk program. We have the school committee, which has some decisions to make relative to the SRO, the school resource officer program. By the way, that program was created with no public process and no involvement of the school committee. So this would be the first time the school committee is involved in determining whether or not officers should even be in schools, and if so, what their role should be. And when I say the school committee would be involved, that means the public would be involved, because they do everything in public view. They have public hearings about these things. So that provides an opportunity for public involvement, which never happened before. And then town meeting has a role to play here too. Town meeting is in charge of the budget itself. And so, I hope that board members are going to support the recommendation and approach of the task force, which is to shift resources from policing to this new social service model, and really start to deepen our engagement in addressing equity issues at the root. I hope they're going to do that. If they don't, then town meeting has an opportunity to do that itself, and to say, like, well, we think, it's too bad the select board doesn't support this model, but we do, and we'd like to shift resources from here to there to support that. And so there's a lot of different players here, and a lot of different potential outcomes. And our commitment as a task force has been to speak with anybody who's interested in learning more about our work. And it's all there in our report. There's links to all of the raw data, so people can do their own analysis of the data. We did our analysis, but people are welcome to do that too. And we've been as committed, fully committed to having an open, transparent process. And all of our meetings are recorded, so people can go watch back all the way from the fall all the way up until now. And I've said time and time again, don't just believe what people are saying about our work. Watch us work, and you'll see exactly what our orientation has been to this. How committed these task force members have been to it. I mean, literally meeting every single Friday morning at 8 a.m. since August. I think we took a week off during like the holiday break there, and subcommittee meetings on top of that. And then the staff, tremendous staff support from the town administrator to the HR director, from town council's office to the Office of Community, CDIC, ODICR, Office of Diversity, Inclusion, Community Relations, and also to former Chief Dan O'Leary, who's been at every one of our meetings. Like, tremendous staff support that we've gotten, and none greater than Devin Williams, who is also support for the select board, who's been helping us out. But these are all people that have, the volunteers who have given of their time, and not just time, but emotional energy that they've put into this, as well as the staff members who have taken this seriously and been there with us and responded to every single request, and we've had many, every step of the way. We just have really good people working on this. And, I couldn't be more proud, not just of the final product, but also the process that got us there.
Raul, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. It was a real honor, and we'll see everyone next week with another edition of In Depth Brookline. I'm sorry, Brookline Hub In Depth. I got the name of my own show wrong.